I'd like to welcome everybody here today, all the faculty and all the students who will be watching through video. I'm very happy to have Dr. Lataianu present his research today. Thank you for doing so. These colloquia have been going on now about a year or so. And in these colloquia, we have the opportunity to hear the research that faculty do. And it's always very interesting and delightful to hear what faculty are doing when they're not in the classroom. I think for students, it's a very great opportunity to hear about work certainly that may have been mentioned in your courses, but also to see what professors do when they are not in the classroom. And hopefully you begin to see how issues and ideas are discussed and researched. And hopefully you may even consider a career in sociology as a goal for yourself. Once again, thank you, Dr. Lataianu, and also thanks Dr. Traver and Dr. Zeltzer for organizing the symposium, and Heather Au for her technical assistance. Thanks to all of you.
I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Gabriel Lataianu. He's an Assistant Professor of Sociology here at Queensborough Community College. He graduated with an MA in Sociology from the Jagiellonian University in Cracow, Poland, and a Ph.D. from the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, Poland. Since 2007, he's taught courses in sociology in Arizona, New Jersey, and New York. Between 2004 and 2010, he worked as a counselor for immigrant children in Phoenix, Arizona. I should add that his first job in the United States after immigrating from Romania was working for Southwest Key Programs, Inc., the largest service provider for immigrant children in the United States. And with that, I leave you to our speaker.
Thank you very much, Dr. Seltzer, Dr. Jankowski, and Dr. Traver for your welcoming words, introduction, and I feel among colleagues and friends too. Thank you very much. I will swiftly shift to my presentation. So the title is Awakening the Immigrant Children's Rights During the Trump Administration. I will, this is the main focus. At the end, I will comment shortly also about, Biden administration's, agenda in this area and some, policies until now. So for decades, the United States authorities didn't make a clear distinction between minors and adults apprehended at the southern border. And this was due to the fact that the United States didn't have any law to explicitly protect immigrant children. In all other countries, the rights of children, citizens or non-citizens, are guaranteed by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child that was ratified in 1990. But the United States didn't ratify it. Actually, the United States and Somalia are the only United Nations members which didn't do this. Therefore, without legal protection, many times unaccompanied immigrant children have been placed along with adults in congested, substandard facilities, waiting for a long time until they were released to a sponsor in the United States or deported. However, the situation of immigrant children would change in the 90s. In 1985, Lizette Flores, a minor asylum seeker from El Salvador, claimed that she was abused by adults while detained by what is now called the Immigration Customs Enforcement, in short, ICE. She filed a class action lawsuit and challenged the procedures regarding the detention and release of immigrant children. After 12 years of litigation, in 1997, the parties signed the so-called Flores Settlement Agreement, FSA, or Flores Settlement Agreement. Flores is from the girl's name, Lizette Flores. This is not a law, but a legally binding contract between the government as defendant and the child protection organizations representing Lizette Flores as plaintiff. A third party, which is the judge of a federal court from California, is overseeing if the agreement is correctly implemented. The whole agreement is based on the principle of the best interest of the child. By this contract, the government is obligated to place immigrant children in the least restrictive setting possible in order to protect them from abuses. This shelter must be licensed by the local state, assuring that they provide high standards of care to children. I mean, access to food, education, medical, legal, and religious services, as well as regular contact with their family. Taking into account that institutionalization is detrimental to the well-being of children, these facilities must make constant efforts to process their cases as soon as possible in order to determine whether they qualify for release in the United States with their family sponsor or for being removed to their country of origin. Initially, these facilities were placed under the responsibility of what is now ICE, which is a law enforcement agency. But since 2003, the shelters were transferred to ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, a social services agency subordinated to the Department of Human and Health Services. This transfer represented a shift of approaching the immigrant children. They were no longer treated rather as criminals, but as vulnerable children in need of protection. In recent years, Flores Agreement has been amended twice. If at the beginning it was designed to protect only the rights of unaccompanied immigrant minors, since 2016, its regulations have been extended to all immigrant minors regardless of their family status. Also, because of the high flows of immigrant children in 2016, it was introduced the rule of 20 days. That was setting the time frame in which the temporary shelters have to either release the children in the US to their family sponsor or to deport them. Perhaps I need to clarify what's a sponsor. Well, the sponsor must be a family member with no criminal record, but with demonstrated economic resources to take care of the child and willing to do it until the local immigration court makes a final decision in the case. If the child doesn't have a sponsor, but the lawyer determines that she or he has a case of political asylum, the clinician tries to find the best foster family placement. And if the child doesn't have either a sponsor or a case for political asylum, she or he is returned to the country of origin. Basically, in a way or another, the child must exit the shelter in maximum 20 days. In order not to create a humanitarian crisis, the late Obama administration diligently applied the 20 days rule, releasing immigrant children, in most cases, releasing immigrant children together with their parents. But the conservative activists and the new installed Trump administration considered this decision as a pull factor, as an invitation of more immigrant adults to come to the United States along with their children, since they knew that they would be released faster than coming alone. During his presidency, Donald Trump attacked constantly the Flores Agreement. It was one of his main focuses on his political agenda. He attacked constantly this agreement. In analyzing the policy on this matter, we identified 3 strategies to weaken this agreement. So I put, in a very schematic way, these 2 strategies. The first one was based on utilizing the Flores Agreement as a deterrence tool. The Trump administration skillfully used the ambiguities of the agreement in order to be able to separate the children from their parents, hoping that this would deter them to come to the United States. If the 20 days rule is referring only to children, and if nothing in the Flores Agreement requires the release of whole families, then it was possible to apply the so-called zero tolerance policy. On April 6, 2018, the US Attorney General announced that all undocumented migrant adults would be fully prosecuted, regardless of whether they came with their children or not. This meant a de facto separation of families. Children were classified as unaccompanied minors and therefore placed in temporary shelters under ORR supervision, while their parents as adults got placed in ICE prisons. Just a second, I have here, a sort of scheme. What happened, during the family separations? So adults went to federal immigration jails under ICE, supervision, and children in ORR, Office for Refugee Resettlement shelters, temporary shelters. Okay, the policy was presented as a strict application of the existing United States laws, and if any, the family separations were only an unintended side effect, but not the main goal. Facing a huge political, mass media, and civic backlash on June 20th, 2018, the former President Trump issued an executive order to stop the policy. Yet the order specifies that, I quote, where appropriate and consistent with law and available resources, I finish the quote, the government would keep families in family detention centers. We'll talk about family detention centers in a while. So the order disregarded the 20 days rule and didn't mention any measure to reunify the already separated families. 6 days later, United States Judge Dana Sobro corrected Trump's executive order mandating that children younger than 5 years old must be reunified with their parents within 14 days, while older children within 30 days. Okay, now I will shift to the second policy. To the second strategy. The second strategy could be called Eliminate Flores Agreement. This strategy was based on the idea that if you cannot use the agreement, then try to get rid of it. So they try to eliminate it. In September 2018, ICE attorneys proposed a federal rule attempting to terminate the agreement by keeping the immigrant families in huge family detention centers. Until their legal cases reach the final court decision. In such a way, the release wouldn't be necessary. More specifically, the immigrant families apprehended at the border would be no longer separated, but sheltered together in modern family centers. These facilities would respect most of children's rights stipulated in Flores Agreement, and they would be run by ICE with no state licensing requirements. The ICE attorneys emphasized that the main point of this proposal was that immigrant families will stay together until the very end of the legal case under ICE supervision. However, this strategy didn't go too far because on September 27, 2019, the federal judge Dolly G, who oversees the implementation of Flores Agreement, blocked the federal rule and suspended the elimination of the Flores Agreement on the grounds of not respecting the 20 days rule. In a way, the policy proposal hit a brick wall. Now let's shift to the third strategy. The third strategy might be called outsourced Flores Agreement. This strategy was really a sort of exporting the problem south of the border. In January 2019, the Trump administration initiated the so-called Remain in Mexico program, by which thousands of families willing to apply for asylum had to wait in Mexico until they were assessed for credible fear. And later, most of them, let's say not all of them, and later called to the immigration court on the territory of the United States. After this brief introduction of these strategies, I would like to talk briefly about the implication of these strategies. Now, let's talk about the first one. The human impact was horrendous for the first strategy. Mass media and civil society reports abound of examples when the most basic children's rights guaranteed by Flores Agreement were blatantly disregarded. Horror stories came to light about children kept in cage-like congested areas in too low or too high temperatures with no access to warm food, basic sanitary conditions, improper medication, physical and sexual abuses, and poor mental health and educational services. The first strategy manifestly violated the central principle of the Flores Agreement. I mean, to assure in all situations the best interest of the child. In other words, the best interest of the child wasn't respected from many points of view. When a child is separated from the family, when a child is separated from the family, her or his best interest is brutally abused. In order to have a better understanding of the cruelty of family separation policy, I will limit my presentation to only one aspect that I know not only from books and media, but also from my experience, direct experience as a former case manager and clinician in one of the ORR supervised centers in Phoenix, Arizona. Now, let's start just a second. Let's start with a fragment from an email exchange between an ORR official and the top ICE official, just one day after Judge's Sabro order. I quote, "In short, no, we don't have any linkages from parents to children, save a handful. We have a list of parent alien numbers, but no way to link them to children." I end the quote. Indeed, the authorities could link only 60 parents with their kids out of more than 3,000 already separated families. Top officials from ICE and ORR stated several times that the reunification wouldn't be so difficult. Reunification is fine, there is no problem with this because they have a centralized database. But it was no such a centralized database to link parents to their separated children. The government started a titanic effort to count thousands of files in order to extract the needed information. On the other hand, many lawyers representing the parents launched their campaign to find the separated children. The issue was complicated by the fact that usually adult cases are processed faster through expedited removal, and there were cases of parents who had been deported without being informed about the whereabouts of their children. Just a second to shift to this. Many times, the Border Patrol officers failed to mention in the child's paperwork that he or she came together with a family member. Later on, ORR case managers didn't know that the child came accompanied, unless he or she said that. Sometimes children are too young, unaware of their situation, afraid of ORR officials, or unable to speak Spanish. Please remember that more than 50% of Guatemalans speak mostly local main languages as native languages. They learn, Spanish as a foreign language. Or they came without any personal documents and they didn't know the full name of the parent or they didn't know their full name and date of birth. As a case manager, I deal frequently with situations when children stated in the initial interviews that they came with a family member, but they were separated when apprehended by La Migra, so as they call the Border Patrol. And they didn't know where their parents were located. Or they stated that they have relatives in the United States, but didn't remember any phone numbers or the numbers got lost in the river or desert they crossed. So additionally, parents incarcerated in the ICE prisons also had difficulties to locate their children. As prisoners, they have the right to make only 2 brief phone calls per week. In order to get somebody to answer the 800 ORR line, a prisoner needed to wait on hold for 1 hour or more. Even if an ORR official answered the phone, he or she usually was reluctant to give information about the children's whereabouts, mainly for security reasons. We were prohibited to give details to anybody. After we could give some information about children in our care, but after many types of verifications. Communication and reunification become much more difficult if the parent is deported, especially if they live in poor, rural, remote areas of Central America. This institutional and communication chaos resulted in more than 3,900 children separated from their families for longer or shorter periods of time. Just a second. Look to these numbers, yeah. So again, communication chaos resulted in more than 3,900 children being separated from their families for longer or shorter periods of time. Yet the hard truth is that as of June 2021, 391 children were still not reunified with their parents. I repeat this, 391 children were still not reunified with their parents. Sadly, some of them might not be reunified ever. Also of great concern was the fact that 6 children died in ICE custody between September 2018 and May 2019, after almost a decade of no deaths. The crisis of family separation caused a huge backlash from mass media and civil society with daily media events, street rallies, petitions, open letters, and public statements against this policy at all levels. In the long run, in the collective memory, Trump administration will be associated, most likely, with the family separation policy, as Roosevelt administration is linked to the internment of Japanese Americans. Yet on the short term, President Trump reached his political goal of posing tough on immigration just in time for the midterm elections of 2018. Now, I will shift now to the effects or implications of the second and third strategies. So the second strategy had no impact since the family detention centers didn't materialize. If applied, and who knows, in the future, family centers could come back. If applied, this policy would have violated the Flores Agreement, stipulating that the immigrant children had to be placed in the least restrictive setting. True, kids had to be kept together with their families, but a family center is still an institution under militarized ICE supervision for long periods. The ICE officials stated that the families would spend around 6 months in such centers due to expedited legal procedures. But this is highly unlikely, since a typical immigration case lasts around 730 days, around 2 years. So 6 months is not feasible, okay? Keeping children in institutions for years is highly detrimental for their well-being. An institution is still an institution. For the Trump administration, the third strategy seems to work better in terms of reducing the number of families and children arriving at the southern border. In the second part of the year 2019, there were 60% fewer family units apprehended on the border. Until spring 2020, more than 70,000 asylum seekers, many parents and their children, have been sent back to wait in Mexico. The human rights activists documented hundreds of cases of Central American immigrants robbed, kidnapped, raped in notoriously dangerous Mexican border towns. But the third strategy could be more consequential in the long run, placing the hot potato south of the border. Asylum seekers in Mexico become like Syrians, Venezuelans, Rohingya refugees who do not disturb the domestic political agenda. The immigrants are out of the national territory and out of the scrutiny of mass media and human rights activists. Simply, if immigrant children and their families would be kept out of the borders, the Flores Agreement becomes irrelevant, and all opposition to the policy becomes weaker. For now, the Flores Agreement contract, as imperfect as it is, appears as the best guarantee of protection for immigrant children, since the United States Constitution or international treaties the United States has ratified do not deal explicitly with them. It is a shame that Flores Agreement, which was created in 1997 as a temporary fixture, is still the main legislative reference to protect immigrant children. Having in mind the extreme polarization of the political scene, I dare to predict that chances to issue a law in this area are close to zero, at least in the short to medium term. The courts protecting the agreement have been the only safeguard against total disregard of immigrant children's rights. Okay, this is my presentation. If you agree, we have time, I could say some words about, Biden administration. Okay, I will take 2 minutes more, to present some issues about the current administration. Before ending the presentation, I would comment very briefly about current administration performance in this area. The new administration has abolished most of the executive anti-immigration orders in the first days after taking the power. Perceiving the new regime as more open, the southern border has been crossed by several waves of immigrants, many of them minors. Until now, more than 1.7 million unauthorized foreigners, an unprecedented number, have been apprehended at the southern border. Until now, I mean from the beginning of this year. The last wave, highly publicized last month, consisted mostly of migrants from Haiti. The Biden administration has tried to adopt a more humane approach to immigration, protecting the families. But journalists and activists documented cases of deported families back to their countries of origin, and sometimes abusive treatment in the government facilities. The hard truth is that Biden's administration agenda is not a priority and doesn't have a clear structure. It looks like a collection of ad hoc measures, a sort of hodgepodge. Yet we should acknowledge also the strong opposition from Republicans to any sensible policy in this area. Many progressive immigration activists criticize the current administration's lack of focus on immigration policies. For example, no progress in the promised DACA path to citizenship. They also blame the administration for the continuation of some of Trump's policies. An example would be abusing Title 42, a public health measure allowing the officials to deport immediately foreigners apprehended at the border in order to control the spread of COVID-19 virus. What's amazing, and this is the last comment for today, what's amazing is what I read several days ago in Washington Post. So I read about Biden's administration preparation to reinstate Trump's era policy of remain in Mexico. Supposedly next month, in November, this reinstatement will take place. We see that the third Trump strategy is very appealing. The Remain in Mexico policy appears to be inspired by the decade-long Australia policy to process asylum seekers offshore, mostly on Nauru and Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. I read articles about plans to place the asylum seekers in refugee camps in distant islands in Greece, far away from the continental territory. Last month, United Kingdom stated that the Afghan asylum seekers should wait for processing in Pakistan and Turkey. What we see, at least it seems that the outsourcing of migration hot potato is getting shape. It's a new approach to keep the refugees out of the national borders, or if that is not feasible, place them as far away as possible from the centers of power. And okay, this is my my presentation. And before ending my presentation, I want to share with you some, let's say, photos from my time spent in Phoenix, Arizona. Look, kids at the end of my work with them, they didn't know how to express their gratitude, and many times they did drawings, wrote letters to me, and I have also letters to my wife. Also, Manuela was my co-worker, and she was a clinician too. So, for example, this is from, look to this larger, el sueño inconcluso. This means failed dream. Look how a child described in his drawing his experiences crossing the desert. You see maras like gang members, ladrones like thieves before reaching the border. After this, the continuation of the drawing is the next slide. You'll see the helicopter from immigration, and coyotes, and all these drawings express their fears and their experiences, their trauma. Sometimes I was a clinician dealing with psychological trauma. Look, sometimes they and took pens and did the weaving with my name and my wife's name. I have a whole bag of pens with this little signs of gratitude for me and for my wife, and different other letters and drawings from kids in our care in Phoenix, Arizona. So it was my first job after just emigrating to this country, and it was a fascinating job, a difficult one. I had to learn not only let's say everyday English, but also to learn Spanish very fast. And I share with you also, it was a very exciting time, especially during the Thanksgiving, when the workers dressed to scare kids. We transform our offices in scare houses, and this is with masks, and this is without mask. You see me here in the back, in the hat. And sometimes we took our kids to participate in different events. This is an event this month in October is the month to fight against breast cancer, and this was an event to raise awareness about breast cancer. This is another one, and here is Manuela, my wife, in the left. Okay, so this is all my presentation for today. I hope you enjoyed or you found my presentation interesting. And now, if you want to ask questions or make some comments, I'm ready to address them. Yes, please.
Gabriel, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, congratulations, great work.
Thank you.
I liked it. Good luck.
Thank
Now,
you.
a question I have. When you talk about children, what is the cutoff date, age? What they consider children and adults, number one. And secondly, how this policy of the United States differ or equal that of the UN? Is it much different? What does the UN does or other countries do that's different than the United States? Or what the United States do that different other countries? Worse, better?
Okay, firstly, look, when I came to this country, I used mostly the term minor.
Right.
But minor, is a person under the age of 18. And it's still in place here in the United States, this concept of minor, especially in legal, area. But I noticed, I observed that in the last decades, not only United Nations, but also other international organizations prefer to use the term children. Somehow in daily parlance, children mean minors. So this is in general, but from my direct experience working in a shelter in Phoenix, Arizona, most of the minors, most of the children were in this age category of 15 to almost 18. When they turn 18, exactly in the day when they turn 18, an ICE officer came to our facility and took him or her. So the majority of children were in fact in the age category of 15 to 18, almost 18. But we had also little children, I mean, 2 years, 3, 5 years of age. It was much more difficult to take care of these little children. They had specific needs. It was difficult. But I would say that 80% were between 15 and almost 18. Now, the second question, what's different? United Nations, except Somalia, is the only country that didn't sign the United Nations Convention on rights of children. And this means that United States is protecting only citizen children, but no protection for non-citizen children. In other nations, European nations, in Australia, in Canada, in South American nations, children, all children, citizens or non-citizens, are protected by this convention are protected by this United Nations Convention on Children's Rights. In other words, other nations have an obligation by ratifying the international treaty to take care of all children, regardless of their no legal status. In our country here in the United States, only citizen children are protected by law. Non-citizen children are protected only by this, let's say, fragile legislative contract called Flores Agreement. This is the only legislative, act protecting children here. It's not a law, it's a contract. I don't know if it's clear enough. So other countries are obligated to assure all rights to provide high quality services to all kids, regardless of their legal status, because all other nations except Somalia and the United States signed the United Nations Convention on Children's Rights.
Do
Okay.
other countries separate the children when they arrive in a particular country or not?
I know about specific examples. For example, I'm familiar with the Spanish system. In Spain, yes, they are separated. But, the foreigner kids and the immigrant kids have the same rights as local kids, Spanish citizen kids, because Spain signed the United Nations Convention on Children's Rights. Okay, there are some violators of this, international treaty, but you're still under, pressure to follow the stipulations of the United Nations treaty. United States is, free of this pressure to follow the United Nations stipulations.
Okay, thank you, Gabriel. Thank you.
Yes, Amy?
Thanks so much for this important and very moving talk. I have two questions for you as well. I think that the last set of questions really gets at the fact that, there is this kind of grouping of young people in a certain age, in a certain age bracket, right? 15 to 18, which indicates that there might be mixed motives for why they're coming, right? It might be they're pursuing safety, they're being hounded by gangs at home, but they're also looking for educational and economic opportunity.
Yes.
And my understanding is that American immigration law doesn't really allow for that nuance, right? You're either a refugee or you're a member of a family and you're sponsored in that way, or you're a visa holder. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to, the larger context of American immigration law and how that might limit some of the opportunities for these young people. And then I also just wonder on a more personal level, how you as someone who had recently immigrated yourself kind of made sense of the experiences of these young people. If you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, good. Look, the first question. Okay, I will share from my experience. At the beginning of my work at Southwest programs in Phoenix, Arizona, there were very few minors or children who applied for political asylum. This was because, the pro bono attorneys were not so well prepared, well versed to interview kids in Spanish, they, they were rather English-speaking attorneys and had problems with understanding the kids' situation. But with the time, and I got involved slowly in this, and other, clinicians got involved in this. We contacted other pro bono attorneys, more informed about Central America and speaking Spanish too. And with the time, we had, better interviews and better screening, and we managed to identify, let's say, I would say that between 10 and 15% of all kids in our center applied for political asylum. They had cases of political asylum on grounds of gang threatening. Some of them were victims of domestic violence. Some of them were orphans. Some of kids were physically and sexually abused home, and the others, very few, they were discriminated in their country of origin because of their sexual orientation. And I would say that around 10 to 15% of kids applied for political asylum, and roughly half of them got political asylum status. Yes, this is true. Sometimes it was difficult to separate where the economic reasons, economic motives, and education motives were separated from other reasons like violence as push factors. Look, as a case manager and also a clinician, I performed thousands of interviews, and one of our main, let's say, one of our main focuses was to identify kids with cases of political asylum. If we identified, cases of domestic violence, of gang violence, of discrimination on political and religious and sexual orientation, we reported these cases to pro bono attorneys, and they did, in-depth interviews. So we try to separate, to identify. We try to identify immigrant children with cases of political asylum. I would say that there were some, minors who had a relatively good economic situation in their country of origin, and they migrated only for economic reasons. This is true. Some of them came also for a better education. This is true too. And nothing in this world is perfectly in black and white. There are different shades and different gray areas. But we try to do our job in the best way. And I would add, from my, you asked me about my experience as a recent immigrant to this country. Look, from the very beginning of my studies and career in sociology, I was, fascinated by this area of immigration. Unfortunately, I couldn't, I didn't have enough opportunities to develop this, but, I was at the beginning of my stay in the United States, fortunate enough to find a job in this area. And at the beginning, it was a sort of cultural shock because I was coming from Eastern Europe, where I was educated in communist times, and it was a strong pressure on people in former communist countries to study a lot, to be proficient in education, to get a good education. And think about Cuba. A lot of pressure to to study and to get educated. And I was very surprised to discover that there were kids in this world who were so poorly educated. For the first time in my life, I saw, kids, illiterate kids, illiterate young men, I would say, they were 16 or 17 years old, unable to write down their name. In some cases, they knew how to draw their names, but they didn't, didn't understand the difference between the letter A and letter L, for example, from Alfredo, let's say. I was shocked, to get in touch with young people unable to write down their name. And also, it was a surprise to me to discover that Central America is so culturally rich. I didn't know, for example, that in Guatemala, about 50% of the population are direct descendants of Mayan people, and they still speak, Mayan languages. I'm partially, I'm an anthropologist too, and it was a sort of field work, For example, there were kids speaking Mam language, and from the next village, they were very close to the village of, let's say we could have a kid from a village, and next to this village, it was another kid, and they spoke two very different, Mayan languages. For example, one spoke Quiche, and others spoke Cachique, and others spoke Mam, and others spoke Quechua, and these languages were so different, even if they came from the same regions, from neighboring villages. They had problems of communication in this local, they call dialects, local languages. It's interesting to learn that there are still people descending directly from Mayans. Also, it was this is the last about this. This was a very satisfying job, because I had the feeling that I can help a person directly. Here at Queensborough Community College, I can help young people to have a better education, to advance in their life and career, etc. But there, sometimes the life and death depended on my job. Sometimes I felt the burden on my shoulder that, if I don't do well my job, if I don't do well, the interviews, I could put one's life or well-being in jeopardy, for a long time or forever. I'm very proud that because of my reports, about 15 to 20 young, persons, children, won their political asylum cases. At least directly, I contributed directly to at least 15 to 20 cases of positive, successful political asylum cases. This is all what I wanted to say about this subject. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. Thank you.
There are other comments? Judy, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very great presentation as usual. And I just have a question. Have you been paying attention to the, death squad migration going on in Africa from across the Sahara Desert through the Mediterranean Sea as people try to access Europe? Many of them perish in the sea, and they use inflatable boat. Some of them don't make it. Italian government sometimes will send tugboats to the sea to rescue people. Okay, so this has been a very terrible situation going on in terms of migration. So I was wondering, if you paid attention to that, and if it would be something of interest to you, since you're interested in migration, because you sometimes pregnant women, young women, teenagers, do take this journey, sometimes driven by their boyfriend or partner, trying to have them cross over to Europe as a way to make a way for them to come, to come later on over the years, that if they're pregnant or they have small kids, authorities will be likely to allow them in. And without recourse, that those children or teenage pregnant girls or mothers could perish in the sea. No consideration about that. They're just looking at, they will cross over. After 2-3 years, they will invite them there without paying attention. So many young girls and toddlers have died in this process. I thought maybe I wanted to know if you heard about it, if it's something of interest to your academic research. Thank you.
Look, I wasn't directly involved in this, but I follow the news from Europe. I follow the news from Spain, Italy, Greece, and there are many reports about cases as you presented, asked. Yes, indeed, I would say that teenage girls, teenage females risk more than men than boys, because they could be victims of sexual abuses, of sexual exploitation, rapes. Yes, from time to time we had cases of girls raped during their trip from Central America to United States. Yes, I would say that is also a gender dimension in this. Yes, I'm in our country we deal with immigrants dying while trying to cross the desert. In Europe, we are dealing with immigrants dying while trying to cross the sea, Mediterranean Sea. And almost daily, I watch Spanish television daily, and almost daily you have reports of immigrants dying on the sea. Unfortunately, this is a very complex and sad reality of our world, and it's rather difficult to find a solution. And it's not a lot of political will to do this. In fact, yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Very nice talk. I was thinking about what you were saying, and maybe as a way to, I'm just thinking in terms of reforming policy or thinking about how to redo policy, based on your experience and as a sociologist, what are a couple things that you would suggest that would really make a difference to reform the system and make it work much better for the children involved?
Yeah. Look, the reform, the system. Firstly, we should screen better which children or minors are at risk. In fact, many sociologists, social scientists, general public are not very aware about the level of violence in Central America. I show my students when I'm teaching this chapter on migration that the levels of urban violence is higher in El Salvador or Honduras than in Iraq or Afghanistan. One of the highest rates of violence, urban violence, is in these countries, El Salvador, Honduras, and partially Guatemala. And indeed, many of these kids, of these minors, are victims of gang violence. Here we are talking about gang violence. I heard so many cases of kids, being threatened, like, you're a teenager, a boy, 16 years old. You get a message from the Mareros, Mara gang. If you don't join us in 1 week, we kill you and we rape your sister. And they are not kidding. They are doing this. And in order to escape, the young man, the young person, together with his sister, they need to leave the city. They need to go to the United States to escape the threat. And the threat are real. It's a huge level of gang violence in these countries. So we need to do better to identify these cases of urban violence to give them a chance for political asylum in this country. Also, it's a huge level of sexual violence in these countries, especially in Guatemala. Many Guatemalans women, many Guatemalan girls are sexually abused. They are victims of rapes and sexual exploitation. And we need to do better in screening these girls and help them to give them political asylum. Also, we should do better in identifying victims of violence because of being a gay, being a lesbian. I had cases of teenagers at the very risk to be killed because they were gays or lesbians. So, in short, to identify better these cases of political asylum. Also, this is, as a sociologist, I would say the best solution would be to address, the roots of this massive immigration to the United States. The roots, I mean, to offer better economic opportunities in these Central American nations. I heard, some voices advocating for a sort of Marshall Plan for Central America, a Marshall Plan. United States and other countries around, like Canada or Western Europe, have enough resources to put money in developing their infrastructure and economy in general, infrastructure and industry and economy in general. If people will have, better work opportunities, they will not leave their homes. Immigration is not an easy decision. If people will have a better life, an improved life, they will not leave these nations. Also, as a sociologist, I don't know exactly economically how is it possible, but I would advocate for, better prices for their agricultural products. For example, I was very surprised to learn that, as I well remember, that for a sack of coffee producers, and many kids worked on coffee plantations, for a sack of coffee, a farmer received $20, $30, a sack of 50 kilograms of coffee, and I compared how many coffees you could make out of a sack of 50 kilograms, about 100 pounds, in a Starbucks, coffee shop. So the money they receive for coffee is peanuts, is almost nothing. They work for little money, and it's a lot of rural poverty, and also they live in traditional societies where usually they have many kids, 5, 7, 8, 9 kids, and you have poverty reproduced from one generation to the next one, not only because of lack of economic opportunities, also because of a relative high number of children per family, higher fertility. So for now, this is my answer for this. Thank you, Jeff. Other questions or comments?
Gabriel, we can't thank you enough for your presentation today. It was really excellent and a great representation of the work of our faculty and the potential avenues for our students who are interested in research and sociological research in particular. So thank you so much for taking the time and for the work that you do. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.